How's everyone doing? Thanks for joining me on my small engine repair channel. Today's project is on this little YardMachines 5 horsepower 22-inch two-stage snowblower. And the problem it's having is it won't start. So we're going to dive into the carburetor and see if we can get this thing back up and running. Alright guys, so this little snow machine belongs to one of my neighbors, and we're just going to try and get this thing fixed up. He's looking to sell it. So I'm going to show you guys how to dive into the carburetor on one of these little 5 horsepower Tecumseh engines. The horsepower, or the carburetor, excuse me, is up and underneath here. Here's the float bowl. Looks like it's got a little bit of wetness there, so definitely maybe a bit of a leaking issue there, but we'll take a look at that when we get this thing torn apart. So first thing we're gonna have to do is take off this heat shield, then we're gonna have to take off this cover, and we'll go and get into the carburetor after that. All right, so to get off this heat shield first, there's a little 5/16 here and a 7/16 bolt there. Just zip those guys out. So the next thing you gotta do is we'll take the key out and we'll take this choke knob off. A lot of times you can just pull it off with your hands. If not, just get yourself a wide screwdriver and pop that off, flathead. All right, the next thing we gotta do is take off this 5/16 and these couple of Phillips screws here. Alright, now this guard comes out, just slide it past, and the grounding strap's attached down here. So you can take that off from that end here and just, let that dangle down, that's fine. So now we have access to our carburetor here. So to get this carburetor off, you're gonna have to take off this primer line. Alright. And we're going to have to take off that fuel line. There's that clamp there. Just use a set of pliers and move that clamp over. And then there are, well, to get access to, there's nuts right there. There's a nut, I think it's probably 7/16, and a nut here, 7/16. So you could take that off. Or the other way you can do it is just take the whole manifold off. It might be a little bit easier even to get access to these bolts. Although to get access to this one, you're going to have to take off the muffler. So however you decide is the best way for you, you can take these guys off. But just keep in mind there's probably gaskets. You can probably see maybe there's a gasket there in between. So just be careful when you're taking either the carburetor off the intake or the intake off of the block. There's going to be definitely some gaskets there that you're going to want to make sure you don't wreck them. So before I can take the fuel line off, you either have to have a fuel shut off, which this machine doesn't, or you have to clamp the fuel line somehow. I've got a pair of fuel line clamps here. You just stick that guy on there, and then the fuel line clamp here. Just squeeze that, move that over. And then you're just going to want to be careful with this fuel line. if you grab it with a set of pliers and try and wiggle it off, I've wrecked fuel line that way. So just be careful. I've got a fuel line removal tool that I made. I can hook up a link to the video on that down in the description below. You will probably leak a little bit of fuel here, so maybe just get yourself a little rag or fuel line comes right off of there. Now, $1 million question, do I want to take it off the intake or take it off just here? Let me see if I can get access to this, because sometimes when you start turning the nut that I showed you there, the bolt that goes through will start turning as well. So you need to actually be able to have access to that bolt back there to hold that while you're spinning that nut. So a lot of times I just take the whole intake off. So that's probably what I'm going to do here. Now to get this muffler bolt out, you can see they have like a little bracket. Now if you can see that very well in the video, but there's a little bracket right here where I'm pointing at underneath these two bolts. And the top part of the bracket gets bent over on one of the flat spots of the bolt. And that kind of just keeps it from loosening out. So to get that off, you kind of have to make sure you fold that back just using a flathead screwdriver. Just get yourself a flathead screwdriver, and usually you can just, it's fairly soft metal. Sometimes you need a hammer. There, that one's off. That one's off. And let's see, those look like 7/16. I'm going to use a socket and a ratchet on these things, guys. If you use a impact, sometimes, okay, that one's fairly loose. If you use an impact, sometimes what happens, that one's loose too. If those bolts get rusted, a lot of times they get rusted in the block where they hook up. Then if they get rusted and you use an impact, you could snap them off. So I always try and just use hand power initially just to see if they're really tight. And if they are, you just got to be very careful when you're taking these off. You don't snap them off. And now I have really good access to the intake. Just use a big Phillips head screwdriver. These aren't usually overly tight. You usually can get them off hand tight, so, or with a hand tool. Now this is where you just want to be careful, because like I said, there's a gasket back there, and if you can just kind of tap it, usually you can get that to come off. Now the last thing we have to worry about here is this linkage here for the governor for the throttle. So first thing you want to do is make a note of the holes that they're in. And let me show you a little trick that I use. Just get like a little pick, a straight pick or something. And what you can do is, if there's multiple holes, you can just kind of draw a line with your pick that indicates which of the multiple holes that linkage is going to go back into. To save you some time afterwards, or take a picture, or, you know, review the video. So this linkage just comes off. It's a Z-bend. So you just got to twist it like so. And now we've got carburetor, intake all together. So we're going to go ahead and take this apart on the bench. All right, so first thing I want to do here, now that I have it up on the bench, is I want to go ahead and try and drain out some of the fuel. This one actually has a nice fuel drain. Sometimes if you just tilt it in a specific way, you can see the fuel will just run out of the inlet there. And the reason I'm going to do this is twofold. Really, I'm going to get a chance to look at the condition of the fuel, see if it's sort of last year's fuel, see if there's any water in it. I'll just drain out the rest out of the bottom drain hole. The other purpose for this fuel is I'm going to use it a little bit as a cleaning agent to try and kind of clean off the outside of this thing before I start cracking into it and getting into it. So now I'm going to go ahead and start cleaning up the outside. The reason why I want to clean up the outside first before I get busting into this thing is because I don't want any of this dirt falling into my nice clean carburetor. So I'll just use some of this old fuel with a toothbrush and then just kind of clean this off. And it doesn't have to be spotless, but just not any major gunk and dirt. It's not too bad. So just make your way around the outside of it. Just try to get the outside, you know, as clean as you can. Of course, you can skip this step if you don't feel like doing it. That's your prerogative. Alright, so that's pretty decent. Alright, now I just blow off the outside with a little compressed air. Maybe a clean shop towel, and you can see it looks definitely much better. So now we can start cracking into this guy. Try and keep your work environment kind of clean if you can. And take the bowl nut off the bottom. That serves as your main jet as well on these Tecumseh carbs. It's a 1/2 inch. You might get a little bit more fuel come out. This is your main culprit, guys, if you're having issues, is this thing gets clogged up with debris and bad gas, ethanol fuel. So there's a bunch of little holes that you want to make sure are nice and clean. You can see there's a bigger hole there that looks like it's pretty clean. All right, there is on this one a hole in the top, and that one looks pretty clean. And then there's usually this guy that everyone forgets about. This little guy right there that everyone forgets about. So a lot of times that's your culprit if you get some surging and stuff like that. So you just take a little piece of bread tie or something like that, piece of wire. This one's a little too big. Go back into my treasure chest. Get a slightly smaller one. And that should go through. All right. So there was, I think, a little bit of schmeck in there. Now, if you don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, which most people aren't going to spend the money to get an ultrasonic cleaner to clean out carburetors when you only got 1 or 2 machines that have your carburetor, you can just use a can of carburetor cleaner. So you just start sticking the hose in all the little holes and just make sure you're getting some good flow and spray. And don't forget that little guy. All right. And then you can take off your float bowl, and this one looks pretty clean. If it's not clean, then you can clean it out with some of this carb spray, and if it's really bad, if it's rusty and kind of like gunky in there, then you can use a bit of steel wool or sandpaper or something to clean that up. Here's the float bowl gasket. If that's all cracked or not supple, it's all brittle, then you want to replace that. You could take your float pin out next. Sometimes you need a pair of pliers if your nails are cut nice and short. Just grab yourself a little pair of pliers. And your float with your needle valve is going to come out next. Now the needle valves on these particular Tecumseh engines do not have a rubber tip on them. So it doesn't have a rubber tip, it's just aluminum or whatever. And the rubber tip is down in the seat area, down in here. If your oil seems to be getting filled up with some fuel, or there's fuel leaking out the front side of your carburetor onto the ground, then that's an indicator, a true indicator that the needle is not making good contact and closing off the fuel coming in through that needle and seat assembly. So you could just easily replace the needle and seat. Comes in a kit, and it might be $5 or $7. So in here we have an emulsion tube. It's a plastic one with a couple O-rings. I typically don't mess around with these plastic ones, but if you wanted to get it out, you're going to have to take off these 2 screws for the choke assembly, and there it's down in there. You can see that red tube. You're going to have to get a screwdriver in there and push that red tube downwards to try and get that out. But I typically don't mess with that too much. Now you want to be careful not spraying your rubber seat and the emulsion tube with any carb spray, because any of these rubber seals, rubber components, they actually will swell and you'll damage them. So I don't spray any carb spray in here without taking out that needle valve, or sorry, the seat and the emulsion tube first. This one's nice and clean. Now if you did need to, there is a special tool. You can buy it, even an aftermarket one, but Tecumseh sells a needle and seat removal tool. It's just like a little crochet hook. You can just go to your wife's or husband's crocheting supplies and steal the smallest little one. Don't tell him or her I told you to do that. And then you just stick it in there through the center of that seat, and you stick it down there, and then you just pull it out. So I am not going to do that in this one. I'm just going to blow this out because it looks really nice with some compressed air. Now the other thing too is you could spray these with some carb spray, as long as you chased that with some raw fuel almost immediately afterwards, because then the carb spray wouldn't have a chance to eat away at that stuff. Okay, so the other thing I want to show you about this carburetor, and this one gets missed a lot too, is underneath this little black cap right here on these Tecumseh carbs, there is a little idle jet. Sometimes these little caps can be a pain in the butt to get out, or they're missing altogether. But there you go. There's a little flathead screw, and you can just take a little flathead screwdriver and unscrew that jet. This is another culprit if your engine is surging up and down, because this thing again has a large hole that goes through side to side that pulls fuel up through this little guy. Now this hole is so tiny, and this is what usually gets clogged. You're not going to, well, there you go. There's a little hole there. You kind of have to use a piece of wire from a wire brush, or I've got one in the end of a matchstick, or you can used a piece of wire from just like a electrical wire, strand electrical wire, and you're going to want to stick that in there and make sure that's not clogged. Spray it with a little bit of carb spray through the end. You can see it coming out each side. So that's nice and clean. And guys, that is pretty much it. I mean, you can spray down in here in the idle circuit with some carb spray. That is pretty much it on one of these. I mean, you could spray in the primer tube. All right, to put it back together, just the reverse of what we did to take it apart. Pretty simple, actually. Just put your idle jet back in there, screw it back in, and it just screws in till it bottoms out. And it's just brass, so don't over tighten it and strip the head on that thing. Just hand tight. Okay, put your cap back on if you still have one. If yours is missing, don't fret. It's not going to be a huge issue. All right. Now from here, when I put my carbs back together, I like to do it with, with my hands, bare hands, because those gloves sometimes contain some contaminants with oil residue and stuff from previous jobs. The other thing, so what's going to be next is the float and the needle valve. Now the float, you can test the float to see if it's taken on any fluid just by shaking it. If you hear any fluid in there, then you're going to want to make sure that you replace that float. You don't typically find too many issues with these plastic ones, but the older brass, I think, floats that Tecumseh used to have, those would be a little bit more susceptible to that issue. So just going to clean that up nice. All right, and the needle valve has a little clip on it. The clip just fits just like so, and it's a little finicky, so you got to keep the float in that sort of a position until you get it positioned, until you get the needle valve positioned inside where the seat is. And then once it's in the seat area, you're good. Just line up the holes now for your pin. Okay, now another use for this tool is to set the float height properly. If the float height is not set properly, the thing will run either a little, like it won't allow enough fuel or too much fuel into the bowl area, and it won't shut it off and turn it on properly. So this is another sort of, use for this tool. And you put it, that little flat area, you kind of put it on the base, and your float should be pretty much touching that. And mine has a little bit of space there. Sorry if this is not in focus there. Okay, mine has a little bit of space there. You can see that. So this is a bit of an adjustable float, and you're going to adjust it using the little pin that we put the needle valve on. All right, so what we need to do is have the float actually go down a little bit more. So we need to push that little pin. Let me point to it here for you. That little pin right there. We need to push that up a little bit. So just get yourself that little flathead screwdriver, and just bend that tab up a little bit. It's a little bit of sort of trial and error. When you bend it up a little, you can see the float. Maybe you can see it now, but the float comes down a little bit. And now I might have gone a little too far with it, because you can see the float is catching. So I'm going to have to bend that back down just a smidge. And again, it's a bit of trial and error. I might have gone the other. Well, it's pretty close. Yeah, that's good there now. So that's set up properly now. Put my float bowl gasket back on. Now the float bowls on these Tecumsehs go on a certain way. You can't just put it on any which way you want. You can see how there's a flat piece on your float on the back side. That has to line up with the line on the bottom of your float bowl. So you can see how I'm doing that. Right? And then you put your bowl nut back on, which is also your, as I said, it's your main jet. And just tighten that back up. And I believe, yes, this bowl nut is actually missing a gasket. There should be a little gasket in between this bowl nut and the bowl. So I think I have a spare one of those kicking around. I'm going to try and find that and put that on. Alright, so I found a new gasket that goes on there. Now it's ready to go. And that might have been where that little bit of fuel was coming from originally there when I was just looking at it right off the bat. It's probably just leaking a little bit out through there. Alright, so now it's ready to go back on the machine. Keys in, throttle's up, choke is on, a couple shots of the primer. I can hear it gurgling. I'm going to use the electric start, see if that works. Turn it on. Wanting to run on choke a little bit there. Alright guys, so yeah, I just needed to warm up a little bit, and then it runs off choke. No issues there. So I think I'm just going to continue on with servicing this thing. I'm going to service the spark plug. I'm going to change the oil. I'm going to check the belts. I'm going to service the all of the shear pins. Just lubricate those, and I think this one they'll obviously just clean it up, and this one will be ready for sale. So hopefully the carb clean video is going to help some folks out, and if you like the video, please consider smashing the like button. That really helps me out on the channel. If you have any comments or questions, you can go ahead and leave them down below, and if you're not a subscriber, consider doing so. It really helps me out as well. So thanks again for watching, and until our next project, guys, take care.